to lecture 11. We're going to be talking about trauma and stressor-related disorders and dissociative disorders today. So we're going to start by talking about the definitions of stress and trauma from a psychological perspective. And then the disorders that we'll be focusing on in this class are post-traumatic stress disorder, 2 trauma-related disorders of childhood, and the 3 dissociative disorders that are described in DSM. So the trauma-related disorders in your textbook are talked about in chapter 5, and dissociative disorders are talked about in chapter 6. Okay, so we're going to start out by first defining stress, which we've talked about already in this class before, but basically stress just refers to a feeling of emotional strain or pressure. We've talked about environments that can cause stress. An example from the depression lecture was the impact of poverty on risk for depression, because poverty is such a significant stressor. It's often characterized by a lack of control over the environment, by unpredictability, by subordinate social status, and potentially by a lack of outlets for frustration. But these are some of the characteristics of the environment or of the person experiencing the environment that contribute to environmental stress. Stress can also be driven by internal experiences. Although anxiety and depression initially their development can be triggered by stress, once those disorders are present, the symptoms of the disorder themselves can cause stress internally. We've also talked in this class about good stress. So stress is part of arousal. It's part of just sort of being alert and being awake. Doing any kind of demanding activity is a form of emotional strain and pressure, but it's not necessarily a negative thing. And environmental causes of stress aren't necessarily negative either. So examples of that could include planning a wedding or having a baby. Some level of stress is necessary for optimal performance because, again, stress is just related to arousal and effort. But of course, as we've talked about already, stress is the main etiological factor for depression and also generalized anxiety disorder. So usually when the symptoms of these disorders start, it's because the person went through a stressful time period. Stress also contributes to health. So it's strongly related to the experience of chronic pain, and stress interacts with chronic illnesses to cause a lot of disability. So stress is especially related to metabolic disorders like diabetes and obesity, and to cardiovascular disorders like hypertension, high blood pressure. And then lastly, even though stress isn't necessarily involved in the etiology of every form of psychopathology, it is still often a trigger for symptoms of psychopathology. So stress is usually involved in triggering someone to have a panic attack. A lot of life stress often precedes the onset of a psychotic episode. So stress is a pretty potent, it has a potent impact on human life and functioning. So trauma is a subset of stress. All traumas are an example of stress, but not all forms of stress are considered traumatic. And the DSM really defines trauma as anything that threatens life or bodily integrity. So actual or threatened death, serious injury, sexual violence that the person experiences themselves, that they witness someone else experiencing, that they didn't necessarily witness, but heard about someone that they are really close to experiencing, so like a romantic partner, a parent, a child. Or in some cases that they never experience themselves and don't have someone close to them experience, but that they're repeatedly exposed to upsetting details of through their work. So an example of this could be police officers investigating child pornography and child sexual abuse who are exposed to lots of discussion of violence and sexual violence against children. It can also happen with psychologists who treat a lot of PTSD patients and hear repeatedly about a lot of really traumatic events. So broadly defined, and again, thinking of trauma mostly as related to things that threaten death or bodily integrity, it's a threat to survival. And so organisms that are experiencing a trauma have an adaptive, automatic physiological survival response. So I've talked before about the fight or flight response and how it's mediated by the sympathetic nervous system. It's activated when organisms are under pressure and sense an immediate threat to their safety. So when someone is experiencing fear, which is the predominant emotion that people do experience during a trauma. There's actually a third branch of this physiological reaction. So its full name is the fight, flight, or freeze response. And freezing is really a physiological response to uncertain trauma. So when an organism still isn't sure if it needs to fight or run away. And it can also be a response to uncontrollable, unpreventable trauma. So in those instances, freezing can go so far as to involve tonic immobility, which is another word for playing dead. So humans and animals share these responses to trauma. They're highly conserved, very adaptive responses to a threat to life. This is what our body is kind of meant to do when we go through a trauma. So what is post-traumatic stress disorder? PTSD, in addition to being characterized by trauma exposure, has 4 other key components. It's a disorder of memory related to the trauma. It's maintained by avoidance of trauma cues. It's characterized by negative alterations in mood and cognition, and by changes in level of arousal and reactivity. So in order to get diagnosed with PTSD, someone has to have experienced a trauma as defined by DSM. They have to experience intrusive memories of the trauma. And these memories can take the form of just intrusive thoughts, so not unlike intrusive worry thoughts in GAD. They can take the form of recurrent distressing dreams or nightmares where someone relives the trauma in their sleep. It can be experienced as an intense flashback where a person actually feels as though the event is reoccurring, or to a slightly lesser degree than actually feeling like the event is reoccurring, having the same psychological reaction, so the same psychological distress that you had during the trauma when you're exposed to a trauma cue, or having the same physiological reaction that you had during the trauma when you're exposed to a trauma cue. So all of these are alterations in the way that trauma is remembered. These are all maladaptive ways of remembering a trauma. PTSD is characterized by avoidance of trauma cues. So the cues that can trigger some of these intrusive memories, people with PTSD avoid them. Those are both internal cues, so thoughts, feelings, memories about the trauma, and also external cues, so people, places, activities that remind the person of the trauma. PTSD is characterized by negative alterations in cognition, so difficulty with memory of aspects of the trauma, difficulty with feeling connected to other people. Similar to depression, people with PTSD might experience diminished interest or participation in activities, so that social withdrawal. They might experience anhedonia, so the persistent inability to feel positive emotions. Just like depression and just like anxiety too, PTSD is characterized by negative, distorted beliefs. So someone with PTSD might experience really exaggeratedly negative beliefs about themselves, the world, or other people. Similar to some of the cognitive distortions that we talked about in depression. They might experience distorted cognitions that are more specific to the trauma that lead them to inappropriately blame themselves or feel guilty for the trauma happening to them, or make other inappropriate internal, stable, and global attributions about the cause of the trauma. And then lastly, PTSD involves alterations in arousal and reactivity. So this can be cognitive arousal, concentration problems. It can be physiological arousal, so a sign that the sympathetic nervous system is active, like hypervigilance, or always being on the lookout for danger, or having an exaggerated startle response, so jumping and being startled really easily. It can look more behavioral and emotional, so having a lot of pent-up anger and irritability, not unlike someone who's in a manic episode. So anger and irritability is related to high levels of physiological and mental stimulation and arousal. It can also look like really reckless, impulsive, and self-destructive behavior. So again, with looking at the criteria for PTSD, they should be looking a little bit similar to some of the criteria for mood disorders. And that's because PTSD and depression are not really that different. Whereas depression is caused by stress, PTSD is caused by trauma, but the etiological factors of the environment are very similar. And so are some of the mood, cognition, and activity related symptoms. Okay, so I'm going to play a video of people's first person perspectives of what PTSD is like. And as you're watching this video, really think about some of the key symptoms of PTSD. So the avoidance, the extreme emotional or physiological reactions to trauma triggers or trauma reminders, the inappropriate self-blame or feelings of guilt and shame.
It's like living with a leash on a little bit. You can do some stuff, but every now and then you remember that it's there.
I was living in Japan during the earthquake in 2011.
A few weeks and months of political unrest while I was living overseas. We lived with bags by the door ready to go in case we needed to get out.
I found out in 2008 I had PTSD, complex PTSD, but I think the diagnosis should have probably been made when I was 14 years old.
I was raped, and as a result, I live with PTSD.
The civil war in Lebanon broke out in 1975, I was only 17 years old. I lived through that for about 12 years.
As it kind of sunk in, I started to feel really guilty because I had always associated PTSD with people who had been to war, and I just didn't think I deserved it. The PTSD triggers, they ambush you. You don't know when it's going to come. It's sort of the unknown. Every day you wake up and you don't know if you're going to have a trigger today.
I was at a movie and there's a part where this woman got trapped in a car. I had a serious panic attack.
There's a song that was talking about like shooting and armed robbery, and just hearing that song, like, that was all it took.
Something happened when I was 13, and when my trigger happens, in that moment, I am 13.
Usually the sounds of jet planes overhead would trigger off a memory for me of those days. It would make me feel weak in the legs, and my memory will go back to that time trying to look after my children when they were little and protect them. You know, all I had to do is hear a jet plane, and that's where my mind will go.
At times, it has literally felt like I'm dying. You feel like this, you're never going to get past this.
So in that discussion of triggers, they really emphasized how when they have an intrusive memory related to their trauma, that memory is experienced almost as if it's actually happening. So if it's not a full-blown flashback where the person experiencing it actually sort of loses their sense of where they are in time and feels like they are actually reliving it, they might just experience the same emotions that they had. So the feeling of dread and terror that she described as feeling like she is about to die, or the physiological reactions and feelings that they had at the time. So feeling weak in the legs, feeling like you're 13 years old again. So what they're describing is memories that are incredibly powerful, incredibly persistent, and that are not experienced like any other memories. So this is just a little timeline of how PTSD develops, because similar to the psychotic spectrum of disorders and the schizophrenia spectrum, PTSD, the full diagnosis requires a certain duration of symptoms, but there are diagnoses for people who are experiencing impairing PTSD symptoms of a shorter duration. So when thinking about who is at risk for PTSD and how PTSD develops, of course, a trauma is required. In PTSD, it's known as the index trauma, or the trauma that is the ultimate trigger for the PTSD symptoms, and the trauma that the PTSD memories are centered around. It's also important to think about pre-trauma risk factors, which we're going to talk about in the next couple slides. So what individual difference factors predispose a person to developing PTSD after an index trauma. And then in order to meet criteria for PTSD, you have to have those symptoms that we talked about for at least 6 months after the trauma. Or sorry, you have to have them, they have to be present 6 months after the trauma. You don't have to have had them for that full 6 months, but they have to be so persistent that you're still experiencing them 6 months later. Acute stress disorder is, I will get to that in just 1 second, but the pre-trauma risk factors that will predict who goes on to experience PTSD. So having an acute response to trauma, experiencing fear and the full-blown fight or flight reaction or freezing, everyone experiences that in response to trauma. That's normal, it's adaptive. And in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, experiencing PTSD symptoms like hyperarousal, emotional numbing, intrusive memories, sleep disturbances, being easily startled, having the memory be easily triggered and feel really vivid, all of that is normal in the immediate aftermath of a trauma. PTSD by definition is a long-term response to trauma, and not all trauma causes PTSD. So when thinking about where PTSD comes from, the phrase that I want to really emphasize in this lecture is everyone has a breaking point. So trauma by definition is inherently destructive and negative and psychologically damaging. But depending on the individual, so their pre-trauma diathesis, the risk factors that they are born with or that they acquire throughout their life prior to trauma exposure, and the nature of the trauma or stress, those two things interact to predict whether someone will develop PTSD or acute stress disorder after a trauma. So some of the pre-trauma risk factors for developing PTSD after a trauma are having anxiety and depression, or having some of the symptoms or the vulnerability factors for anxiety and depression. So some of the vulnerability factors that we've talked about are experiencing just a lot of negative emotions as like a trait level thing, or being someone who's prone to hyperarousal, so having a really sensitive HPA axis or an overactive fight or flight system. Similar to how we talked about with people who have panic disorders, just have a system that's sensitive enough to be triggered into fight or flight really easily. Those are all risk factors for developing PTSD, as well as just general risk factors for anxiety and depression. Certain coping strategies for dealing with stress and trauma are more related to risk of PTSD. So people who tend to cope by avoiding, by trying not to think about the thing that is upsetting them or the problem that they're having, or trying to put off or not have to deal with solving the problem directly, that coping strategy is a risk factor for developing PTSD after a major trauma. So is rumination as a coping strategy. So in the depression lecture, we talked about how persistent thoughts about the past and about things that went wrong in the past can be a coping strategy and a way of trying to solve problems. But as a coping strategy, it's risky and it can lead to the development of PTSD when someone applies that way of thinking to thinking about a trauma. A major social risk factor for PTSD is not having adequate social support following a trauma. So humans are naturally social, and as we talked about with complex bereavement, having support, having a social network, having people to lean on, having people to sort of take care of you when you're in the immediate aftermath of a trauma or a bereavement and not really functioning well, experiencing a lot of normal adaptive PTSD symptoms, being taken care of during that time can really help protect against the development of PTSD. And then lastly, another risk factor for developing PTSD following a trauma is having been exposed to trauma before. So we talked in the depression lecture about how the HPA axis is kind of a growing and changing thing, and exposure to chronic stress can modulate it, but so can exposure to acute stress. Experience of trauma can sensitize the HPA axis and make it more likely to have a strong response to future traumas. Prior exposure to trauma also influences beliefs about the world. So we've talked about how feeling like the world is dangerous or feeling like the self doesn't have control, those are general psychological risk factors for the development of most forms of psychopathology, including anxiety and depression, but also PTSD. So acute stress disorder, it's very similar to PTSD, and I'm not really going to make a huge distinction between them, but basically it involves having impairing PTSD symptoms anywhere from 3 days to 1 month after the trauma. So it's a response, it's a slight extension of the normative response to trauma. Having PTSD symptoms in the immediate aftermath of a trauma is considered normal and adaptive, but acute stress disorder is a diagnosis for people who are having some impairment from PTSD symptoms in the longer term, but still short-term aftermath of a trauma. Acute stress disorder is certainly a big risk factor for PTSD, but it doesn't always turn into PTSD. And there are some cases of people who wouldn't meet criteria for acute stress disorder, but who have a later onset of PTSD within 6 months of the trauma. So what does cause PTSD? So obviously trauma causes PTSD. It's one of the only disorders in the DSM that has a specific, completely external cause. You cannot have PTSD without trauma exposure. But the type of trauma is really important, and specifically there's a relationship between the intensity of the trauma that someone is exposed to and their likelihood for developing PTSD. So remember, everyone has a breaking point, and some traumas are objectively more intense, objectively more traumatizing on average than others. So interpersonal or assaultive violence is the type of trauma that's most likely to cause PTSD. People who are hurt by other people are more likely to develop PTSD than people who are hurt by accident or people who are hurt in natural disasters. So one of the biggest causes of PTSD, maybe not surprisingly, is having been a prisoner of war during the Vietnam War. We just know this statistic because there was a really high prevalence of PTSD in survivors of the Vietnam War. And so there's been a lot of research on the characteristics of PTSD in that population. But basically being a prisoner of war was the most intense way that you could be traumatized during the Vietnam War. It involved starvation and torture and isolation and basically constant threat of death. So it's not surprising that 70% of people who were exposed to that type of trauma went on to develop PTSD. And then similarly, being held captive, tortured, or kidnapped outside of a war context, same thing, really high chance of developing PTSD. The type of stressors that are the most potent and also the most relatively common as potent stressors go are rape and military combat. So rape is the type of civilian trauma that's most likely to cause PTSD, and combat stress is the type of military trauma most likely to cause PTSD, or that accounts for the most cases of PTSD. Other types of assault, being beaten up, being shot or stabbed, being mugged, and being sexually assaulted without being raped, are also all likely to cause PTSD, but to varying degrees. So the intent, even with the same type of trauma, the level of exposure also matters. So with Hurricane Katrina, the hurricane hit New Orleans the hardest, and then it continued on to hit the Mississippi and Alabama Gulf Coasts. So there's actually a dose-response relationship between how hard Katrina hit someone's area and the prevalence of PTSD in that area. So in Mississippi and Alabama following Hurricane Katrina, the prevalence of hurricane-related PTSD was anywhere from 12 to 23%, which is really high. But in New Orleans, the city that was hit the hardest by Hurricane Katrina, the prevalence was even higher. It was 30%. So a third of people almost in the city of New Orleans had PTSD 6 months after Hurricane Katrina. In New Orleans, the extent to which someone was exposed to the hurricane predicted their likelihood of having PTSD. So people who lost a loved one to Katrina, people who lost their house, people who experienced an injury or an illness during the hurricane were all more likely to develop PTSD related to the hurricane. Similar findings for 9/11. So overall, the prevalence of PTSD 6 months after 9/11 in the New York City metro area was around 7.5%, which is again really high. But the degree to which someone was actually exposed to the attacks, how close they were, how much they lost in the attacks, predicted their likelihood of having PTSD. So people who witnessed the attacks from Midtown Manhattan, but outside the World Trade Center, had a slightly higher prevalence. People who worked in the World Trade Center and lost their jobs had a higher prevalence. People who were injured themselves had a higher prevalence. And people who knew someone who died and also witnessed the attack themselves had the highest prevalence. So some statistics about PTSD. Trauma is actually really common, and about anywhere from 50 to 70% of Americans at some point in their lives will go through something that can be defined as a trauma according to DSM. Interestingly, there's a gender difference in the prevalence of PTSD. It's not as pronounced as the gender difference in the prevalence of anxiety and depression, but it is still there. So women are twice as likely to have PTSD, even though they're 30% less likely to be exposed to trauma broadly defined. So why is that? The theory is that most of the gender differences in the prevalence of PTSD come from gender differences in the type of trauma that people are most likely to be exposed to. So these are all just examples, except for fire and accident, but these are all examples of common types of trauma exposure for civilians. So setting aside military combat for a minute, the types of civilian trauma exposure that men are more likely to experience are seeing someone get in an accident or getting in an accident themselves, witnessing violence, or experiencing assault with a weapon. The types of civilian trauma that women are more likely to experience are rape and sexual assault, or child sexual abuse. So looking again at this figure, the types of trauma that women are disproportionately exposed to are traumas that are considered more potent or that are more likely to lead to PTSD than the type of traumas, civilian traumas, that men are disproportionately exposed to. So a large part of the gender difference in the prevalence of PTSD simply comes from the fact that women are exposed to more what's called high impact trauma than men. Women are more likely to be raped or sexually assaulted. Nowadays, women and men are closer to equally likely to be exposed to military combat too, except that in the military, women are still more likely to be raped or sexually assaulted than men. So a large part of the gender difference in the prevalence of PTSD comes from gender differences in trauma exposure. It also comes from gender differences in prior trauma history. So women are more likely to have been exposed to rape and sexual assault earlier in their life before experiencing an index trauma, and that puts them at higher risk for developing PTSD as well. There are also gender differences in pre-trauma risk factors like the level of depression and anxiety. Women are more likely to have those symptoms and diagnoses. And it could be because of gender differences in coping styles, with women being more likely to engage in avoidant coping or rumination. and potentially women also being more likely to feel like they have less control over their environments than men do. And these gender differences really come from socialization, from the way that women and girls are raised and expected to behave. So, and the way that men are expected to behave. As I said in a much earlier lecture, women may engage in more avoidance of things that make them anxious because admitting to being anxious is more accepted for women than it is for men. Men may be forced and pressured socially into engaging in more exposure to things that they're afraid of because of fear of social rejection. And then related to beliefs about the world, women are socialized to believe that the world is dangerous for them. And I just showed you statistics that they're more likely to be exposed to highly potent traumas. So that might not be an incorrect belief. And depending on their sociocultural environment, they may really have less control over their lives than men. So these things do put women at higher risk for PTSD. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the two forms of psychotherapy for PTSD and also about the cognitive theories that underlie those forms of treatment. So PTSD is really a memory disorder. It stems from a failure to consolidate trauma memories in the way that other memories are stored in the brain. So by definition, and according to the DSM list of PTSD symptoms, trauma memories function differently than most of our memories. They're more visceral. When trauma memories are experienced, the person actually experiences the sensations that they experienced when they went through the trauma. They're retrieved involuntarily and experienced as flashbacks or re-experienced. And they're often experienced as kind of fragmented and unconnected. So people have memory gaps for trauma memories. They may not remember what was going on right before the trauma. They may forget parts of the trauma. They might not remember how the trauma resolved. Trauma memories also tend to be less integrated into someone's life story, into their autobiography that they can sort of tell themselves, than other memories. So trauma memories are fragmented and unconnected from the rest of the memory network. So just a really quick reminder about the stages of memory. So when we receive sensory information, it's first stored in our sensory memory, and sorry, that's cut off. But our sensory memory is incredibly short-lived. It's just the first sensory relay of information coming from our peripheral nervous system into our central nervous system. So it's that first synapse on the parietal lobe where we feel sensory inputs. That memory is then transitioned into short-term memory or working memory, where we hold it in our conscious awareness. And then memories in the short-term memory store are encoded. So memory information is encoded into neural circuits and stored in long-term memory, which long-term memory is a series of memory networks, so interconnected neurons that are primed to communicate with each other that are stored across our neocortex. So that's long-term memory. And then long-term memory is divided into explicit and implicit branches. Explicit basically just refers to any memory that we can consciously articulate. So our episodic memory of our life experiences, our autobiographical memory, and then our semantic memory for facts, concepts, belief about the world. When we pull something out of long-term memory storage and bring it back into our working memory where we can consciously articulate it, that's called retrieval. So memories can pass between long-term memory and working memory. And the difference is that when something is in working memory, it's activated, it's conscious. When something is in long-term memory, it's not on our conscious mind, but it can be retrieved and brought into our conscious mind at any moment. So I've mentioned already that memory is a network. Memory is made up of interconnected circuits and nodes. So a node might be something like our memory for the concept of school. But when we think about the concept of school, we also trigger other closely related nodes, so other memories that are stored nearby that are triggered by spreading activation from the node for school to the node, for example, the concept of being a student or the concept of a school bus. So trauma memories can be triggered and involuntarily retrieved by the activation of nearby memory nodes. So this is why people with PTSD end up avoiding things that even kind of remind them of their trauma. So it's why avoidance in PTSD can extend and become really pervasive, because memory involves spreading activation, and when a node is activated, it can involuntarily activate nearby nodes in a way that it's hard to control. So by definition, trauma memories are poorly consolidated. They're not encoded and they're not stored in the way that normal memories are. The normal process is for memories to be stored, like I said, in association areas throughout the cortex, but concentrated in the temporal lobe. And when memory is stored in our long-term memory store, it tends to be the network that stores that memory tends to be disconnected from our emotional networks. So when that memory is activated, there's not spreading activation to our limbic system. Memories are in long-term storage are typically verbal and less visceral and emotional. Trauma memories are different because as they're encoded, they retain their connection to the limbic system. They remain really sensory, really emotional. They remain nonverbal. And so when those memory nodes are activated, they cause limbic system activation in a way that normally stored memories don't. Also, because those memories are poorly integrated with other memories and they're not networked in with our long-term memory store as much as they're networked in with our limbic system, when those memories are retrieved, they're basically re-experienced because we don't have context for those memories. They're not integrated into the flow of our autobiographical story. So when we remember them, it's like they're happening all over again. It's not like looking back at our own lives. However, and this is important for treatment, all memories are unstable and subject to change. So during the retrieval process, when a memory is brought out of long-term memory store and into working memory, that circuit is active. And when the circuit is active, it can be rewired, it can be changed. So the act of remembering, the act of reconstructing consciously our memories changes them. So reconsolidation happens when a memory is moved from long-term memory store to working memory, altered by the conscious process of having a memory in our working memory, and then reconsolidated and sent back to that long-term memory store. So reconsolidation refers to the process of changing our long-term memories during working memory retrieval, and it's the key to exposure therapy for PTSD. So when someone goes through exposure-focused therapy for PTSD, they're instructed to create trauma narratives where they repeatedly tell the story of their trauma, the event that happened to them that triggered their PTSD, in tons of detail. So yes, there's a lot of visceral and emotional and sensory detail, so the same kind of things that's triggered when that memory is activated because of its connection to the limbic system, but they're also encouraged to recall specific details and verbalize the memory. So describe it in words, not just in pictures and emotions and vivid imagery. They're also encouraged to integrate the memory into their life story. So to talk about what was happening before the trauma happened, what happened after the trauma, to try to situate and contextualize that memory in their life story so that it's not just sitting there on the surface as if it's still happening. And that process, so bringing that poorly consolidated memory out of long-term memory storage into working memory and restating it, reliving it, but also telling the story in a narrative, conscious way, that changes the memory and it helps to consolidate it better into long-term memory store and contextualize it in our life story. So during that process, though, there's also habituation and safety learning going on. So just like anything that's avoided in an anxiety disorder, repeated exposure helps the organism, in this case the person, to learn that engaging in that behavior, doing that thing that they avoid is actually safe and it's not going to cause them harm. So at the same time that exposure works to integrate trauma memories more fluidly into a person's life story, it also works to help prove to them that it's safe to have that memory. They don't have to restructure their life to avoid it being triggered. So two things are happening during exposure to internal narrative exposure to trauma memories. In addition to being an alteration in memory, so PTSD criterion B, having intrusive recall of the trauma, PTSD is also a negative alteration in mood and cognition. So treatment also focuses on the way that trauma can change a person's schemas and beliefs about the world. Traumas that are really likely to cause PTSD are those that shake people's beliefs about the world, that really like force them to reevaluate how they think about life and the world and themselves. So someone who really strongly believes that the world is a safe place, if they experience a trauma like an accident or being mugged, that could challenge that belief. Someone who really believes that people are inherently good, that belief would really be challenged by the experience of being captured, tortured, or sexually assaulted. So we've talked about how belief that the world is dangerous and belief that the person lacks control are kind of the two most psychologically risky belief systems to have in terms of risk of anxiety, depression, and PTSD. In a little bit more detail, in exposure-based cognitive therapy for PTSD, we talk a lot about stuck points, which is just a term for changes in the belief system in response to trauma. And these beliefs, these stuck points, these changes in belief can be about the dangerousness of the world. So the world is a dangerous place. They can be about trusting other people, so other people are dangerous, or trusting one's own judgment. So I'm incompetent, I'm not in control, I can't trust my own decision making. They can be beliefs about control, so about that person's ability to change and exert control over their own environment. They can be changes in a person's self-worth, so inappropriate guilt or blame, feeling like they deserve to have this trauma happen to them. They can be changes in intimacy, so changes in people's beliefs about their own ability to connect to others. So we talked about schemas related to unlovability in the context of depression, but this can also come up in PTSD, and it can help to explain the social withdrawal and the feeling of disconnectedness from others that happens in PTSD. So when someone experiences a trauma that challenges their core beliefs and that creates these stuck points, they go through one of two processes, or sometimes both processes at the same time. Accommodation involves a change to pre-existing beliefs about the self or world in response to the trauma. So I believed something, but then this trauma happened, and now I have no choice but to change what I believe in response to the trauma because the trauma was evidence that my belief was wrong. Assimilation is the process of integrating the trauma into a pre-existing belief system. So this trauma happened to me, it violates my belief system, but I'm going to tweak either my belief system I'm going to tweak my memory of the trauma or how I interpret the trauma to make it fit into my belief system without changing my beliefs. So in PTSD, in maladaptive assimilation, this often looks like the trauma event being remembered differently and less accurately to prevent disruption of the belief system. And importantly, both accommodation and assimilation can be adaptive processes. Sometimes schemas are wrong and they need to change. Sometimes traumas do convey useful information. Sometimes the way that we think about a trauma or organize it in our mind can be assimilated into an existing belief system by changing the way that we interpret the trauma. So these processes aren't inherently maladaptive, but when they do go awry, they cause the stuck points that we see in PTSD. So an example of this could be someone who was sexually assaulted by a friend. And prior to this experience, they had one belief about rape, that rape means a stranger using force to violently coerce them into having sex against their will without consent. But their sexual assault by a friend challenges that belief because it doesn't look like what they think of as rape. So one maladaptive response to that trauma could be inappropriate assimilation. Rape is a stranger jumping out of a bush. So what happened to me wasn't rape. It must have been a misunderstanding, or I must have asked for it in some way. They must have thought that I was consenting even though I wasn't. So this can lead to PTSD symptoms because if a person's appraisal, if their modified appraisal of the trauma doesn't fit in with their emotional response to the trauma, that can cause symptoms of emotional numbing or feeling detached from their own reactions. And it can cause changes in their belief system to make them feel like they can't trust their judgment anymore. Over accommodation to a trauma like this could be completely changing their belief system about men. So men are all potential rapists and can't be trusted. And this change in belief system would bring about changes in behavior like avoiding men that would make it really difficult to ever disprove that over accommodated belief. If I never let myself be around men anymore, I won't have any opportunities to learn that some men can be trusted. So appropriate accommodation of this experience would look more like realizing, okay, so rape isn't always a stranger using force. Sometimes rape is a person that I thought I could trust coercing me into having sex. Some men can't be trusted, but that doesn't mean that all men can't be. And rather than blaming oneself for experiencing this trauma as a way of assimilating it into a belief system where rape is really clear cut, the person accommodating this trauma into their belief system would realize that maybe they weren't in a position to fight back. Maybe there wasn't physical violence, but there was the threat of violence, and it's normal to freeze in situations like that. So both of these models of PTSD, the change in belief system, the stuck points, and the poorly integrated memory, stem from an understanding of PTSD as an interrupted recovery from trauma. So a typical recovery from trauma looks a lot like PTSD in the immediate aftermath of that trauma. So after a trauma, it's normal to experience temporary physiological hyperarousal. The cortisol that was released during the fight or flight response can hang out in your blood for days after the trauma. And while that's happening, you experience high anxiety and fear. You pay a lot of selective attention to danger in your environment. It's normal to have some temporary changes in belief after a trauma, things that seemed safe before might start to feel dangerous. You might start to feel like the world is dangerous and that you're incompetent. And in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, it's normal for the trauma memory to be fragmented and incomplete. And it's normal for it to be poorly integrated into working memory or into long-term memory, and still integrated with the limbic system in a way that causes re-experiencing and arousal during memory retrieval. During the normal adaptive recovery process, though, people resume their normal activities. So they don't avoid things that trigger reminders of the trauma. They don't avoid things that they used to think were safe. And doing that allows them to experience safety learning. So any changes in their belief system that happen in the immediate aftermath of the trauma can be quickly disproved once they go back to living their normal life. It's adaptive to realize that by definition, a trauma is an unusual experience, and generally it's not adaptive to base your behavior around an unusual experience like a trauma. So people realize that the traumatic event was rare or not representative of what's likely to happen to them in the future. And when people don't avoid trauma memories, when they allow themselves to repeatedly recall the memory, over time, it does become normally integrated, and it becomes part of their autobiographical life story and not something that they re-experience anymore as if it's still happening. PTSD, however, develops when someone after a trauma starts to avoid their normal activities. They don't get the opportunity to experience safety learning and prove to themselves that those activities are still safe. And by avoiding memories of the trauma, they don't have the ability to re-encode and consolidate that memory appropriately. So because of avoidance, beliefs about the self and about the world continue to be over-accommodated or over-assimilated. And the memory continues to be fragmented and poorly integrated because it's not being retrieved into working memory except as an involuntary triggered emotional, sensory, visceral memory. It's not being brought into working memory in a verbal, conscious way. So some takeaways from the treatment of PTSD. The 4 key things are to reduce avoidance, so get people back to living their lives, engage in graded, intentional exposure to memories and thoughts about the trauma, and also to places and people and activities that remind the person of the trauma. Negative cognitions about self and the world, so schemas and belief systems that were inappropriately modified by the trauma need to be returned to baseline. So assimilate the trauma into the belief system and accommodate schemas to adjust for the new reality that the person is living through after the trauma. And then lastly, the trauma needs to be remembered and talked about in an adaptive, non-avoidant way in order to integrate the trauma memory into a person's autobiographical memory store. So just like other anxiety disorders, PTSD is maintained by avoidance, and treatment for PTSD means interrupting that avoidance and in a systematic way that the person is in control of, reintroducing them to their typical life that they were living before the trauma. So these figures should look pretty familiar. We've looked at them so far for the anxiety disorders and for major depressive disorder. But just like other disorders, PTSD involves biological and general psychological risk factors, as well as specific psychological factors that are involved in both the stress and the diathesis. So in terms of biological risk factors, people who are most at risk for developing PTSD after a trauma are those who experience more frequent or more intense negative affect, including HPA axis sensitivity. So people who have a stronger stress response to environmental triggers. Acquisition and extinction of fear learning is also implicated in PTSD. So people who are really good at developing conditioned associations can also be really good at developing conditioned trauma triggers and trauma cues. Another generalized risk factor that people have before trauma exposure is their beliefs about control and danger, their schemas about the world. So some specific diathesis factors at the individual level for PTSD are trauma history. So people who've been exposed to traumas before are more at risk for developing PTSD with a subsequent trauma exposure. And people who have a really rigid belief system. So a belief system that doesn't easily assimilate and accommodate new information. So having a really rigid belief that good people always have good things happen to them and bad people are always punished, when a trauma proves that to not be true, it can really shake a person's belief system, and either they will accommodate that trauma by concluding that their belief is still true. Good people get what they deserve and bad people get what they deserve, but because something bad happened to me, it must mean that I'm a bad person and I deserved it. Or they assimilate, so they deny the severity of their trauma. They try to convince themselves that the trauma wasn't as bad as they thought it was, or that it was their fault, so the person who did it to them wasn't actually a bad person. That's a greater risk factor for PTSD than someone who has a more flexible schema, where they might believe that although it's generally good to try to be a good person, it doesn't necessarily mean that nothing bad will ever happen to you. And then also, specific psychological risk factors for PTSD include the nature of the index trauma. So interpersonal traumas are the most impactful. Something done to you by another person is more likely to cause PTSD than an accident or a natural disaster. So because there are gender differences in PTSD, it's important to think about gender differences in risk factors. And the biggest difference has to do with the nature of index trauma that men and women are exposed to, and gender differences in trauma history. But as we talked about, women do have some biological and general psychological risk factors for anxiety and depression that help to explain why rates of anxiety are higher in women than in men. Okay, so now we're going to talk about trauma disorders of childhood. So these are disorders that are only diagnosed in children and that have to be diagnosed during childhood. I'm going to start out with a quick video.
Everyone in a community has a vested interest in everyone else's children, because everyone else's children determine the next adult population that makes for a successful society. Built into our biology is the need to have responsive interactions with adults.
Neglect for children is when they don't get what the brain is expecting to get, what the child is expecting to get, what we are biologically prepared and waiting for, which is input from those around us.
It's this back and forth serve and return interaction that literally shapes the architecture of the brain.
Serve and return begins when a child looks at something or observes something, makes an utterance, and that represents the serve. And the return is when the parent notices the child doing these things and responds to the child.
Under conditions where serve and return is broken, you literally are pulling away what is the essential ingredient of the development of human brain architecture.
It was a really compelling series of experiments where they started by videotaping the mother and the baby engaging in cooing and smiling. And then they asked the mother to basically put on a blank face and not respond. When a baby is not attended to, that is a sign of danger to the baby biologically. So the stress systems become activated.
In a brain that is constantly bathed in stress hormones, not that's up and down, that comes with normal development. Certain key synapses, the connections between nerves, fail to form, and critical regions of the brain. So neglect both fails to provide the stimulation that's needed to develop the basic architecture, and when it's at a certain level, is one of the most potent activators of the stress biology of a young child. So you get a double whammy.
Science points to 4 categories of the spectrum of neglect. The first category would be what's called occasional inattention, where children experience responsiveness most of the time, but occasionally adults don't respond. There's no harm in that, and in fact, there's probably some benefit.
A child can learn to self-soothe and explore the environment, and all of those opportunities build brain architecture.
The second category, scientists would call chronic understimulation, is where on a regular basis, children have less interaction with the adults around them than is needed for healthy development.
Those children typically, when provided with enriched learning opportunities and more typical levels of serve and return, will show catch-up.
third category is what science would call severe neglect in a family where not only are there prolonged periods of inattention and lack of responsiveness, but often also associated with not being fed enough, not being bathed enough, not having basic needs met.
Neglect is a huge problem in the US. Children are much more likely to be neglected than they are to experience any other kind of maltreatment.
We see the child really being at risk for much more substantial kinds of deficits down the road that don't necessarily get easily fixed or ameliorated. This is where we really need to think about more complicated and often more intensive strategies to help undo those effects.
The fourth category, called severe neglect, generally found in institutional settings, is a result of children living in kind of warehouse type situation in orphanages.
And it doesn't have to even be as extreme as orphanages. It can be experiences that are regretfully occurring in many, many parts of our country.
Often institutional care in this country is under the euphemistic name of transitional care or temporary care or assessment facilities.
If you think about what institutional or residential care would look like for an infant, where there's somebody new coming onto the shift every 8 hours, it really alters the development of the child's brain architecture and other aspects of the child's development.
We have the potential to change children's developmental trajectories.
Interventions can apply to parents, to foster parents or adoptive parents, child care settings, Head Start settings, and other kinds of settings. And really, what they're about is attuning people to the serve and return process.
Neglecting young children is neglecting the foundations of a healthy next generation. The community pays a huge price later in terms of the problems of the next generation, whether it be educational achievement, economic productivity, good citizenship, the ability to parent the next generation. All of the things that have to do with a healthy, prosperous society.
Okay. So, as this video said, emotional neglect and a lack of appropriate interaction with adult caregivers is one of the most stressful experiences possible for an infant. I should also mention that children can get PTSD, and PTSD traumas and symptoms look similar in children as they do to adults. But the attachment disorders are two extreme trauma-related disorders that are caused by not just trauma, but consistent extreme neglect. So reactive attachment disorder involves a lack of responsivity to caregivers. So children who seem really withdrawn, children who don't engage in reciprocal interactions with their caregivers, children who don't seem to respond to being comforted or paid attention to, and children who don't seek out comfort and attention from their caregivers. Disinhibited social engagement disorder, on the other hand, these kids, it's not that they don't interact with adults, they do, but they don't seem to show a consistent preference for which caregiver they interact with. And these are kids who are prone to wandering off with strangers, who don't seem to differentiate between their primary caregiver and literally anyone else. Disinhibited social engagement disorder is similar to the behavior that's seen in infants younger than 9 months old, or younger than 6 months old. This is an age when infants don't really demonstrate separation anxiety. They don't seem to differentiate between their caregivers. After 6 months old, infants form attachments to their primary caregiver, and they might cry if their mom or dad isn't holding them. So it's really normal for children to have some degree of separation anxiety, and neglect creates a disruption in the normal attachment and bonding process that can either lead to a complete refusal of any kind of care and a lack of responsiveness to caregivers in general, or it can lead to sort of indifference to caregivers, not really showing a preference between caregivers as long as someone is taking care of them. And these are both adaptive, understandable responses to extreme neglect. Both are just ways of trying to survive in an institutional setting. So these disorders, reactive attachment disorder and disinterested social engagement disorder, are really only diagnosed in children who've experienced extreme neglect. They're common in institutionalized children, so kids in orphanages and residential care. Prevalence there is as high as 50%. So these are kids who don't have any consistent caregiver and don't get really any back and forth attention. It's also common in kids in the foster care system and kids who've been adopted out of the foster care system. Again, the kids who are in family-based care can still experience neglect, but it's just less likely, and the neglect that is experienced when you're living with a consistent caregiver is often less potent than the neglect that's experienced in institutional settings. So the population prevalence of these attachment disorders in children is pretty low, between 1 and 1.5% of the general child population. Towards the end of this semester, we're going to talk about autism, but during that lecture, I will try to highlight some of the similarities in behavior between autism and attachment disorders. Autism is characterized by very strongly genetically determined social communication deficits. And although kids with autism can and do bond with their primary caregivers, they show some deficits in attachment and in interacting reciprocally with caregivers that are really similar to what's seen in children with attachment disorders. The difference is that attachment disorders are totally acquired. They're caused by extreme environments, and autism is almost 100% genetically mediated. Okay, so I'm gonna just show a quick video on reactive attachment disorder that for whatever reason I can't embed.
I knew something wasn't right early on. Dr. Julia from the Siberian orphanage in February 2003. She didn't clutch me or gaze in my eye. She never rested her head on my shoulder or relaxed into a warm embrace. She didn't respond if I sang or read to her. She was there, but wasn't.
This is Alex. She's my favorite cat. She's the third cat in the house. She always sleeps right next to me on the bed. This is Smudge right here. He licks actually. He has lots of smudges on his face. That's why you call him Smudge. He's a nice cat. He's very obedient. He looks at you on the camera.
In January of 2003, we traveled for the first time to Novosibirsk, Siberia, and we met her, and it was surreal. I will always have that picture embedded in my mind when the caretaker walked toward me, and she was cradled in her arms. That first time I looked at her, I thought, I had never seen a more beautiful baby anywhere. I mean, she was so starkly stunning. She already seemed to have like dimples, and she had these khaki-colored eyes. And she had a runny nose, and it was red, but she had this alabaster skin. And then she was like a piece of porcelain. She was stunning, absolutely stunning. I guess the first thing I thought of was, wow, she must have some stunning mother.
And the other animal we have in the house is me. I'm like the wild monkey.
By the end of maybe the first year, I was really in despair. I had just come to conclude that I had made a mistake and that something must be wrong with me, that I couldn't feel connected to this child. She was always running away from me. She, just never, there was no mother duckling, baby duckling thing going on. There was no sense that, I was the person who was going to protect her. And there was nothing warm, there was nothing fuzzy. I couldn't read to her, I couldn't play with her. It was just like she was there. And the more time went on and the more it was like that, the worse it felt.
I want to become a special ed teacher, which is a teacher who teaches other people, teaches sort of like special and disabled people. And I want to do that because I sort of feel like connected to them in a way, not really, but I really like them and I have a giant interest in them.
What reactive attachment disorder is briefly is that the baby suffers a traumatic disconnect from love and so early on. And they come to believe in their subconscious mind, even though they're so young, that the world is an unsafe place, that there's no one to trust, that adults come and go, that there's very little consistency. And ultimately, they absorb this idea into their tiny little minds, like these little minds are forceful, and they absorb this notion that the only people who they can trust are themselves. From that moment forward, everything, I mean, I'm not saying it was instantaneous change, but everything about our intentions of how we were going to parent will change. Julie's always been an early riser, so we all usually wait between 6 and 6:30. And while Ricky was out getting the chickens out of the coop, Julia and I come downstairs, and I made some fresh squeezed orange juice, and we laid the table for breakfast. And we got the newspapers on the table, so by the time Ricky comes in, cats are fed, and we sit down and we eat some breakfast. Ricky got busy in the kitchen baking his soon-to-be famous madeleines, and after breakfast, we spend some time back in Julia's room, looking at some of her the website that she's making about cooking, and also some drawings, cartoons that she's made, including a drawing that made it into Highlights magazine. And then she played a game of chess with her dad, and he stole her queen, and she wasn't too thrilled about that. But she got over it very quickly, especially since lunch was next. And eating is very much up there among the favorite activities. So we had our typical, Sunday lunch, a nice big salad and some mozzarella sandwiches. And the rest of the afternoon we'll just unwind lazily. Julia will be on the computer for an hour or so. We'll probably just laze around and maybe do some work or read. And then we'll probably have a light dinner tonight before we watch the Oscars. She's become, she's everything. She's my child, and it's like she's my work, and the two have fused together. And it's kind of gratifying in a funny sort of way. I mean, I guess what she's brought to my life in a weird way, and I hope this doesn't sound selfish, but she's brought to my life a mission. Julia's hurt. It's given us all a mission to heal. And that I'm able to do that through my work makes me very lucky. I've not just been given a child, but I've been given a muse.
All right. So that was sort of a parent's perspective on reactive attachment disorder. It's not just that children with RAD or disinhibited social engagement disorder too are unable to or impaired at bonding with adults, but it also makes it difficult for when they are adopted or in a more stable caregiving situation, it makes it difficult for their caregivers to bond with them. So treatment for these attachment disorders, once a child is in a safe and loving family environment, really focuses on doing activities together. So like the Sunday that she described, to enhance the bond, making sure that parents always meet their child's expectations and are always reliable figures in their life, even if the child isn't responding with affection and attachment, that parents consistently give that to them. And basically just interventions that aim at helping the child see the parent as a secure base of attachment. So someone who will be there for them, who will consistently attend to them, and who won't abandon or hurt them. Okay, so we're getting towards the end here. I'm just going to talk a little bit about dissociative disorders, which, like attachment disorders, are also rooted in childhood trauma. So dissociation is something that we haven't really introduced in this class yet, but dissociation is part of the fight, flight, or freeze response. It's a relatively extreme psychological defense against trauma. It's analogous physiologically to animal behaviors like freezing or tonic immobility, so the act of playing dead. And just as freezing and tonic immobility tend to be animal responses to ambiguous or unavoidable traumas, dissociation is a human response to really extreme, hard to control traumas. So the clinical definition of dissociation is a disruption or discontinuity in normal integration of conscious experience, memory, identity, emotion, perception, body representation, motor control, or behavior. Basically, it's a disconnect between our conscious experience and our identity and our physiological embodied experience. So dissociation itself is not that uncommon. It's not inherently pathological. It is a normal physiological response to extreme stress or trauma, or isolated symptoms of dissociation can happen even in normal resting states. So a type of dissociative experience you may have experienced could be if you've ever driven somewhere that you drive really frequently and kind of zoned out while you were driving and just like arrived there without really remembering anything about the drive. That is an experience that people who dissociate also have. If you've ever kind of looked at yourself in the mirror and had a moment where your face didn't really seem like your face or where it felt like a stranger was looking at you, even if it resolved like pretty instantaneously, that is an example of dissociation. It's an interruption between your consciousness, your identity, and your sensory experiences. A more advanced example of dissociation might be buying something and not remembering it and then just discovering it among your stuff later. The feeling that you're outside your body watching yourself, this is a more common one that people experience under extreme stress. Or the experience of not remembering if you have a task on your to-do list, having trouble remembering if you actually did that task or if you just thought about doing it. So having a hard time discerning the difference between like imagination and reality. Isolated incidents of dissociation, so non-pathological dissociation is linked to anxiety, to depression, to substance use, especially alcohol use and marijuana use. Marijuana use can cause dissociation, as can psychedelic drugs, just by the way that they physiologically work. Okay, sorry. I don't know if you can see if my cat is making trouble back there. Okay, so if you want to experience what dissociation kind of feels like, pick a word. It doesn't have to be legume, but just any word, and say it over and over to yourself out loud. What typically happens when you repeat the same word over and over is that it kind of starts to lose its meaning and you sort of lose the thread of that cluster of sounds actually being a word. It kind of just turns into nonsense sounds, and that can be like a slightly disorienting experience because it's like we had a grasp on it at first, we had a mental representation of it and it made sense to us, and then we lost that representation. That's what dissociation feels like. So dissociation is a spectrum. It can range from briefly zoning out and missing parts of a conversation, having like a quick moment where your reflection doesn't look familiar to you or where you don't recognize someone that you know really well, briefly feeling like you're standing outside of your body, feeling kind of lost and disoriented or like your surroundings aren't familiar, losing time, and then a more severe form of dissociation is having a fragmented identity or sort of disconnect in your sense of self. But these experiences exist on a spectrum, and some level of dissociation is pretty normal. So some forms of pathological dissociation separate from dissociative disorders include peritraumatic dissociation, so dissociating during a trauma. This form of dissociation increases the likelihood that someone will go on to experience PTSD from that trauma. About 15% of people with PTSD experience dissociation as part of their PTSD. Certain PTSD symptoms like feeling numb and disconnected from your emotions, feeling disconnected from other people in your life, re-experiencing as if the trauma is actually happening to you, and inability to remember aspects of the trauma. Those are all forms of dissociation, but because they're only happening in the context of PTSD, it's not a dissociative disorder. Dissociation also happens during panic attacks, and when it only happens during a panic attack, it's similarly not a symptom of a dissociative disorder. So this figure shows some of the different aspects of dissociation. Feeling disruptions in your sense of identity, either not really feeling connected to yourself or not being sure who you are, briefly forgetting things or losing time or forgetting chunks of your own life or experience, derealization, so feeling disconnected from the world around you, or depersonalization, feeling disconnected from your own body. Those are all on the spectrum of dissociation. So dissociative disorders usually develop as a reaction to trauma. And what will happen is that when people are chronically experiencing trauma, sometimes they will use dissociation as a coping strategy. the trauma will just be so unpredictable or so extreme that they have a natural physiological dissociative response, similar to an animal freezing in the headlights or playing dead. That response can happen kind of involuntarily, but it's also negatively reinforced because when they dissociate, they get to take a break from the trauma. They aren't experiencing it, they're not living through it. Dissociating can actually even help someone not experience physical pain. So dissociating during a trauma is really reinforcing. And if someone is constantly exposed to trauma, they have many opportunities to experience reinforcement from dissociating. So over time, dissociation becomes a coping strategy that people use to escape trauma. And then over even more time with consistent prolonged trauma exposure, dissociation can start to be cued by conditioned stimuli. So not by trauma itself, but by things that are present during trauma. Things like people or places, reminders of the trauma, physiological states like being anxious or aroused, being hot, being hungry, emotions like stress, anxiety, shame, or sadness, or by memories of the trauma. So whereas dissociation starts as an involuntary extreme reaction to trauma, can become a coping strategy for trauma. In dissociative disorders, it can become an involuntary response to trauma cues that leads to chronic dissociation. So there's a concept known as complex trauma that can lead to what's known as complex PTSD or dissociative disorders. For dissociation to be reinforced, trauma must happen pretty often. There have to be lots of opportunities for the pairing of dissociation and reinforcement. Interpersonal traumas are the most potent, and dissociative disorders typically start with childhood trauma. So the traumas that cause dissociative disorders are child abuse and neglect. There are three named dissociative disorders in the DSM. The first is depersonalization and derealization disorder. So I already defined these concepts, but basically derealization is feeling disconnected from your surroundings, as if everything around you is fake or you're living in a dream, nothing seems real, familiar places seem strange and unfamiliar, your perceptions might be like visually distorted, dreamlike. Depersonalization is feeling like you're outside of your body, like your physiological experiences don't really belong to you. Both of these types of dissociation can be accompanied by distortions in your experience of time, so losing time or feeling like time is moving fast or slow. They can be accompanied by emotional numbing, or they can be accompanied by perceptual alterations, like the feeling that things are not familiar, the feeling that things are dreamlike. This might be sounding a lot like psychosis, but the main difference is that in psychosis, people are unable to distinguish between what is real and what's a perceptual abnormality that's happening in their brain. People who dissociate know that they're dissociating. They don't confuse what happens during dissociative episodes with reality. That's why dissociation can be really stressful, because they can see that something strange is happening to their perceptions and they know it's not real, but they can't control it. So just depersonalization, derealization disorder is relatively rare. It has a prevalence of 1 to 2% in the general population. But again, these types of experiences are relatively common. So isolated dissociative events like briefly feeling like you're outside your body or briefly not recognizing yourself in the mirror, that doesn't necessarily rise to the level of depersonalization or derealization. It has to be a relatively prolonged state lasting at least a couple minutes. But even that is relatively common. So about 15% of people have experienced it at some point in their life. A majority of those people probably experienced it during a panic attack or during a PTSD exacerbation. The second DSM-5 dissociative disorder is dissociative amnesia. So dissociative amnesia really refers to disturbances in memory and perception of time. And it's where you basically lose time. You have an inability to recall important life events, autobiographical information. Often dissociative amnesia is about not remembering aspects of trauma or stressful events. But in some cases, dissociative amnesia can cause basically just brief fugue states where someone kind of forgets who they are. They forget aspects of their identity, even if they might still remember parts of their autobiographical memory. So they remember events in their life, but forget who they are. A specifier for dissociative amnesia is when it co-occurs with dissociative fugue. Dissociative fugue is where someone with dissociative amnesia, not knowing who they are, basically just leaves, like goes off away from their normal environment, seemingly kind of wanders around, or seems like they're purposefully traveling someplace, but they don't know who they are and they don't know why they're going there. So I'm just going to show you a quick video about a case in the news of someone who had dissociative fugue with dissociative amnesia.
was a Category 5 hurricane, Irma. A storm unlike any the Caribbean paradise of St. Thomas had seen before.
It was in some ways a perfect storm of chaos. If someone's going to vanish from the island without any trace, it could have happened then.
And that's exactly what happened. 32-year-old Hannah Up, a beloved teacher at a local Montessori school, had ridden out the storm, only to disappear 8 days later.
We were supposed to have a staff meeting. Hannah didn't show up. Nobody had seen her. And then I went to her house, and she wasn't there. Her car wasn't there.
She drove down to Sapphire Beach, which was her favorite beach. Inside the car were all of her personal items. There was no sign of foul play. She simply vanished.
What many people didn't know is that this was not the first time Hannah had disappeared.
I did not know about her previous disappearances.
Almost 10 years before Hannah went missing in New York City, she was found barely alive, floating face down in the New York harbor. No memory of where she'd been for the past 3 weeks. Doctors diagnosed her with dissociative fugue.
Dissociative fugue means that you have a period where suddenly you've lost your autobiographical memories, the memories that define you as you, but not necessarily other memories.
Who are you?
This rare disorder is sometimes known as the Jason Bourne syndrome.
What's your name?
I don't know. From the wildly popular movies about a CIA assassin who doesn't know who he is, but remembers his training. Elizabeth Vargas in A&E's The Untold Story, Vanished in Paradise, retraces Hannah's life with dissociative fugue and the days before she disappeared. Hannah grew up the daughter of 2 Methodist ministers in Oregon, and at 23 became a public school teacher in New York City.
Everybody describes Hannah as a bright person, engaging, open.
In 2008, she left her New York City apartment to go running and then went missing.
New York City police thought, we're dealing with a terrible crime here. They were looking for a dead body.
Hannah Up was last seen at her Hamilton Heights apartment last Friday.
She became a high-profile missing persons case.
She seemed to have vanished into thin air.
The NYPD says someone has caught a glimpse of a missing teacher.
10 days later, she pops up at an Apple store, of all places,
logging in on her own ID.
And security cam footage shows her being approached by a young man who knows her from school, saying, Hannah, you're Hannah, right? Aren't you missing? And she says, no, I'm not Hannah, and walks away. So a person who has psychogenic fugue to people on the outside may look completely normal. They're doing things, they know how to do things, they understand the world at large, they don't appear to be distressed, they're just in an altered state.
Later, she was spotted using her own gym pass. Investigators were perplexed. Authorities couldn't track her down until she was pulled from the water by crew members of the Staten Island Ferry. Hannah's mother, Barbara Bellis, remembers vividly the moment she found out her daughter was still alive.
Early afternoon when the phone rang. There's a nurse at the emergency room.
What did she say?
She told me that my daughter had been pulled out of the water and she was alive. She was dehydrated, badly sunburned, and hypothermic. But when I first saw her, she had no idea what had happened.
What did she tell you? Did she say, Mom, I can't
How
remember?
She said, I'm fine, but I'm scared. I don't know what happened.
The documentary has this recording of Hannah Up after she was rescued. She's talking to a reporter in a New York City coffee shop.
It goes from going for a run to being the ambulance. And for me, that was 10 minutes past, but it was 3 weeks. Obviously, the hardest part is the period right after. Right, you feel shame and you feel embarrassed and you feel guilt. Sure, all things that I've definitely felt.
After her fugue, Hannah moved to Maryland and there had yet another episode.
Many people of her life believe she was looking to escape her past.
So in 2014, Hannah moved to the island oasis of St. Thomas.
She is the center of the party.
She threw herself into island life, embracing a new set of friends who shared her passion for Zumba. But Hurricane Irma wreaked havoc on the island, and some of her friends say on Hannah too.
Everybody was stressed out, and she was certainly stressed out. And certainly the day before Hannah disappears, people noticed something was off. She seemed to be almost in a trance.
Dissociative fugue occurs in people who've suffered a tremendous trauma. It may have been a trauma in their past, or it might be a recent trauma, like living through a natural disaster.
But Hannah's mother insists that for her daughter, her fugue episodes do not have clear triggers.
I think what's so mysterious is this idea that she loved her life. She was a young woman who definitely loved her life. That doesn't mean she couldn't have been struggling with something deep and dark inside of herself.
It's been almost 2 years since anyone's seen Hannah. Her mother has become a fixture on St. Thomas. She thinks it's possible that Hannah is still alive and is suffering from another fugue.
There are documented cases of fugue states lasting as long as 4 years.
Yeah. And that helps me to keep on going. It's never been an option to give up.
And hopes the answer to where her daughter is can be found here.
Do you think you'll ever know for sure, Margaret, what happened?
I can only tell you that hope is persistent, and many people join me in that hope.
And you can watch The Untold.
So that's just an example of a stress triggering a specific exacerbation of an existing disorder. So just like a lot of severe mental illnesses like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, as well as disorders like panic disorder, social anxiety disorder that have clear and specific etiologies, even though dissociative fugue isn't caused by an acute stress like this as a disorder, a specific episode can be triggered by acute stress. Okay.
Dory Van.
All right, we are nearing the end. This is the last DSM-5 dissociative disorder that I'm going to talk about. So dissociative identity disorder. This is a really controversial diagnosis. It was formerly known as multiple personality disorder. The DSM defines it as a disruption of identity that's characterized by 2 or more distinct personality states. Someone to be diagnosed with DID also has to lose time, so they have to have lapses in their autobiographic memory that are thought to coincide with periods where they were dissociating and identifying with a separate identity. Dissociative identity disorder is caused by child abuse. 97% of people with dissociative identity disorder report childhood physical or sexual abuse, but it's likely to be 100%. And people with this disorder, by definition, have memory lapses for trauma. The population prevalence is similar to the other dissociative disorders, and there is some overlap. So someone can be diagnosed with more than one dissociative disorder, but the prevalence is 1 to 1.5% of the population. This is a really high need mental health population though. So people with DID make up to 15% of psychiatric inpatients. So people who are hospitalized because their psychiatric symptoms put them at physical risk of harm. There's a huge overlap between DID and PTSD, with again, a majority of people with dissociative identity disorder also meeting full criteria for PTSD. So dissociative identity disorder is thought to come about when a young child consistently dissociates during a developmental period where they're forming their sense of self. Kids start to develop a sense of who they are and a sense of identity and uniqueness around the ages of 3 to 4. So consistent traumatization during this developmental period can interfere with that identity development. And specifically, what's thought to be happening is that memories that are formed and encoded in a dissociative state feel different than memories that are encoded in a normal state. And that different feeling of parts of your life story from others over time can start to develop into actually separate identities. So what starts as a single person dissociating and having experiences in their normal state and while dissociated, over time, those 2 separate streams of memories can kind of diverge and form slightly different separate identities. So just like PTSD, dissociative identity disorder is a disorder of memory, specifically memory encoding. So memories encoded during dissociation, and memory retrieval. So retrieval of those memories feeling different and leading to the development of slightly different identities based on different life experiences. I use this picture because a DID patient described her experience with DID as her identity being like a mirror and the trauma that she experienced as a young child having fractured that mirror. So she is the same person, but she has slightly different identity streams that all look a little bit refracted and different and don't come together to form a cohesive whole. That's what DID is really like. However, because it's such a seemingly bizarre and intriguing diagnosis, there have been a lot of misconceptions and a lot of popular cases of DID that turned out to be fake or induced. So I'm going to just play a video about fake DID and then talk about the iatrogenic theory of dissociative identity disorder.
The movie Sybil was a pop culture phenomenon that was instrumental in the creation of a new psychiatric condition, multiple personality disorder. It's still a popular subject for Hollywood, actually. The ABC program United States of Tara covers similar ground. Sybil, though, was in a league of its own. The book sold millions of copies, became an Emmy Award-winning movie, and unleashed a wave of multiple personality cases. But as North American correspondent Jane Cowan reports, there are now suggestions the whole Sybil case was a fraud.
It felt like it wasn't me. It felt like a dreamy state.
For those who suffer from it, multiple personality disorder is a frightening and sometimes debilitating condition. But is it real?
All of a sudden, the person who's talking to you right now, I was just suddenly gone. I just wasn't there.
This is not a circus sideshow. It's not an exciting, fascinating corner of psychiatry. It's an experience that happens to people who've had to fight for their survival as children.
It's powerfully, scandalously hoaxy, I guess you could say.
The idea of multiple personalities burst into the popular imagination in the 70s with one word: Sybil.
No, you just collect yourself, young lady, or we'll be late for church.
It was almost like the Bible had come out again. Everybody was buying this book. 6 million copies of the book sold within a few years after it was first published. And people were, particularly young women and girls, were talking about this book and were obsessing about the book.
I can tell you. I can tell you. I'm not supposed to tell you. I can tell you.
The supposedly true story of a young woman possessed by 16 different personalities made for gripping drama. But soon it became more than entertainment.
Well, before the book was published in 1973, in the entire history of the world, there had been less than 80 documented cases of something resembling multiple personality disorder. Less than 80 cases. After the book came out, within a few years, there were thousands of cases, and interestingly, they cropped up almost exclusively in places where lots and lots of people were reading Sybil.
Now, nearly 40 years on, investigative journalist Debbie Nathan says she can prove the entire Sybil case was little more than elaborate fiction.
It's incredible to think that psychiatrists, psychologists, and all of us could have been fooled by this over-the-top story.
Using records unsealed at New York's John Jay College of Criminal Justice, including treatment notes, letters, tapes, and diaries, Debbie Nathan has painstakingly pieced together what really happened.
You better take out his love real quick. Because God hates bad girls.
As the story goes, Sybil was tortured by a sadistic mother, a trauma so extreme it caused psychic splitting.
My name is Dr. Wilbur, by the way.
She was said to have repressed the memories until they were unearthed by the heroic ministrations of a compassionate psychiatrist, Dr. Cornelia Wilbur. In truth, the treatment looked more like this. In this grainy training film, a young Dr. Wilbur injects psychiatric patients with the barbiturate sodium pentothal.
So she thinks if she gives him this injection of barbiturates and then tells him, you don't have any reason to shake, that suggestion will keep him from shaking.
Although known as truth serum, the drug was later found to produce false memories. It was this World War II era technique called narcosynthesis therapy that Dr. Wilbur later used on Sybil.
She asked her patient leading questions. while her patient was under the influence of a drug that creates fantasies. And that's really how these stories were generated, the stories of her mother's torture.
The myth was compounded when Dr. Cornelia Wilbur joined forces with another ambitious woman, magazine journalist Flora Schreiber, to write the book Sybil.
There were times when the women knew that they were making things up. There were times when they were very confused or naive. A suggestible, fantasy-prone woman, the patient would tell the therapist something, and the therapist would naively believe it. The therapist might later tell the journalist, and the journalist would naively believe it.
Most of the people who have looked at this objectively have come to the belief that this was an enterprise in deception rather than an enterprise that helped and advanced our discipline.
Psychiatrists like Dr. Peter McHugh say not only the Sybil case, but the whole notion of multiple personalities is misguided.
I don't think they're frauds. Don't get me wrong. I believe that they have been persuaded by their experience with the therapeutic world and other influential features that this is a disorder that makes sense to them. Okay? And I believe that by continuing it, they make invalids of themselves.
But psychiatrists like Dr. Jeffrey Smith still diagnose and treat patients with multiple personalities, or dissociative identity disorder, as it's now called.
When you meet these people and you meet their different parts, it's not artificial, it's not strange, it's not physician induced or therapist induced. It's a way of coping with a really, really terrible situation.
Sculptor Robert Oxnam was diagnosed with 11 different personalities 20 years ago.
And I looked at her, I said, you're kidding. I saw that movie, Sybil. I said, I'm not like Sybil. I'm not running around crazy. And sort of psychologically, like Humpty Dumpty, I was trying to get myself back together again. It's almost like family therapy. You discover you have a family inside. This angry kid named Tommy, a witch. Some of these things, all of this happens in childhood. A witch that came out.
One thinks that if you are expressing yourself in this way, that it must mean that you have several personalities. The therapist believes that, begins asking the patient, can we separate those things out? Can we give them names? The patient wonders what to do, and eventually does it, and then the doctor is convinced, or the therapist is convinced that the truth must be there, because after all, something came out of it. The patient is relieved that the doctor has gotten what he or she is looking for, and before you know it, they're walking down the primrose path together.
You have no idea how much crazy is bouncing around that lopsided skull of yours.
While the doctors argue the idea of multiple personalities remains a fixture in American popular culture. And with thousands of Americans living with the diagnosis, unraveling fact from fiction is no less fraught than it was in the 70s.
I have a worry that when a case as prominent as Sybil is put into a deflated position as question, that it might lead people to believe that this doesn't exist. And this does exist. I've gone through a lifetime with it.
Jen Cowan reporting.
Okay, so that video is kind of an overview of some of the controversies around dissociative identity disorder. So the main debate is not whether these symptoms exist. They definitely do. This is something that can be reliably diagnosed by different professionals. The prevalence seems to be pretty consistent internationally. There are people who do have these symptoms, who really demonstrate fractured identity and differences in personality over time with lost time and gaps in their autobiographical memory. That's real. The debate is over whether dissociative identity disorder is caused by chronic childhood abuse and trauma, or whether it's potentially caused by therapeutic suggestion and by people trying to make sense of their dissociative symptoms by labeling different dissociative states with different identities. So there's a lot of there's a pretty big dissociative identity culture on social media, especially TikTok, but also YouTube. There are people who are really well known for having a lot of what's known as alters, for publicizing their dissociative identity disorder, for creating artwork, or even hiring actors to play their alters in really popular YouTube and Instagram videos. This is just an example of what that culture kind of looks like.
Hi everybody, it's Wynn. Hey guys, it's Daniel. Hi, it's Kim Kim. My name's Little Bonwin. Hello everyone, it's Ed. Hi everybody, it's Kit. And welcome to another video by the Entropy System.
Okay, so this isn't to say that this person doesn't have dissociative identity disorder and that people can't have multiple separate identities that feel really different, that feel like they have different ages and genders. That is, again, that's real. But this kind of really elaborated DID system with multiple what's known as alters, alternate personalities who have names and identities and like images is not recommended for DID treatment. So what are iatrogenic effects? Iatrogenic effects are basically when something that's intended to be a treatment, whether that's psychological or physical medicine, actually causes harm. So the video talked about one potential explanation for where dissociative identity symptoms come from. And the idea was that it's therapeutic suggestion. So someone who has a history of trauma and a lot of dissociative experiences comes to a therapist for help, and that therapist sees that the patient dissociates, sees that they have slight differences in personality and reaction to stimuli depending on whether they're in a dissociative state or not, and says, okay, I think that you have multiple identities, multiple personality disorder, now dissociative identity disorder. Let's try to draw those alters out. Let's sit down and talk to them. Let's find out their story. Let's give them names so that it's easier for us to talk about them. Let's try to organize your experience, because I'm assuming that you have these alternate personalities inside of you. We're going to draw them out, figure out who they are, and then ultimately maybe try to integrate them into one single identity. For some patients who are suggestible, who are really prone to wanting approval from a therapist, who are responsive to the therapist seeming excited or more engaged when they talk about different identities, that can be enough to reinforce the development of these elaborated alternate identities. Older treatments that use things like hypnosis or drugs like pentobarbital that actually induce a suggestible state could have created DID symptoms in people who were even less vulnerable to iatrogenic suggestion. One important consideration is the possibility that people with borderline personality disorder are being misdiagnosed as having dissociative identity disorder. So both of these disorders are really closely linked to childhood trauma. Dissociative identity disorder is basically always caused by childhood trauma. Borderline personality disorder is strongly related to childhood trauma, but there are known genetic diathesis that can create borderline personality traits in the absence of trauma. And we'll talk about that in the next lecture. People with borderline personality disorder have a lot of dissociative symptoms. They have, as a symptom, identity confusion, a lack of a stable sense of self, and just looking at basic symptoms, there's a 30 to 70% overlap between these two diagnoses. So although borderline personality disorder has a lot of stigma, there is an established evidence-based and really effective treatment for it. And it could be that misdiagnosing people who actually have borderline with dissociative identity disorder is doing them a disservice. So when treating dissociative identity disorder, or really any dissociative psychopathology, but with DID, the goal is integration. So the goal is to help the patient leave therapy with a single identity, with an integrated personality, with the ability to experience everything in their life without using the coping strategy of dissociating. The goal is definitely not to create a really elaborate system of alternate personalities with names and identities that would be considered doing more harm than good. The intervention is really focused on the trauma. So dissociative identity disorder and the active dissociation is a product of trauma. It's a maladaptive coping response to trauma that then becomes conditioned, so it becomes involuntary and triggered by anything that's even related to the trauma. Patients are taught not to dissociate using grounding techniques to help them stay present in their bodies and to help them process perceptual abnormalities in a way that prevents dissociation. They're also given coping strategies for managing stress and trauma and anxiety without dissociating. Once those strategies are in place and once the patient has gotten more control over their tendency to dissociate, then the treatment looks really similar to treatment for PTSD, treatment that's focused on processing trauma memories, integrating them into a narrative, and assimilating and accommodating schemas and beliefs about the world to flexibly incorporate the traumas. So I can't emphasize enough that encouraging or focusing on alters is not recommended. It's not part of DID treatment. So a summary, because DID is a controversial diagnosis. It's true that there are iatrogenic cases of DID where therapeutic suggestion creates the symptoms of DID. It's also true that people exaggerate these symptoms on social media. But DID is a real diagnosis. The population prevalence is about 1%, and it's really severe and impairing. So regardless of whether these symptoms are shaped and molded by expectations and a culture around DID, either on the internet or with therapists, or whether this is a real response to trauma, either way, these people have real symptoms, and the treatment that helps those symptoms the most is integration and trauma-focused therapy. Okay, so some takeaways from this trauma-focused lecture. PTSD by definition is triggered by trauma, and the important thing to remember about PTSD is that everyone has a breaking point. About 50 to 70% of people will experience a criterion A trauma in their life, but in determining or in whether someone gets PTSD because of that trauma, individual difference factors matter, like temperament, anxiety and depression proneness, coping strategies, social support, experience of previous trauma, and then also the type of trauma matters. So interpersonal trauma, especially rape and military combat, are traumas that are the most likely to cause PTSD in anyone. Once someone experiences a trauma, PTSD is caused and maintained by avoidance. Avoidance leads to the failure to consolidate trauma memories into the autobiographical memory, keeping them on the surface of memory and really interconnected with the limbic system so that when those memories are reactivated, it's like going through the experience all over again. PTSD is also caused by avoidance that leads to changes in the belief system. Some changes in your belief system are really normal after a trauma, but avoidance prevents those changes from being reversed. It prevents assimilation and accommodation from happening in an adaptive way. So the treatment for PTSD is really focused on eliminating avoidance and engaging in exposure to promote integration of the trauma memory, to promote habituation and safety learning for the act of remembering, proving to people that it's safe to remember, and helping to adjust belief systems and schemas about the world to accommodate the trauma. Extreme trauma in childhood, child abuse, child neglect, can lead to attachment disorders and dissociative disorders. Attachment disorders are where children fail to develop a representation of a caregiver as someone who they can have a reciprocal, trusting relationship with. And as a result, when they do have an opportunity to bond with a caregiver, they're impaired at forming that relationship. Dissociative disorders happen to children who are exposed to repeated trauma, not necessarily neglect, but more often abuse, and specifically sexual abuse. Dissociation becomes a maladaptive coping strategy for avoiding the experience of trauma, either by not consciously experiencing it, by dissociating, or by using dissociation as a distraction to help manage physical pain and emotional pain. Over time, dissociation becomes negatively reinforced, and it starts to happen in response to cues that are related to the trauma, not necessarily to trauma itself. And then when dissociation becomes an overlearned automatic behavior, that's when it becomes a dissociative disorder. Okay, so here's some further reading on these topics. There's no reading on PTSD here, but readings on attachment disorders and dissociative disorders. And I apologize for the lateness of this video. I will see you guys in lecture tomorrow. Oops.